some of those things. And you can teach me the jump cut, the crossover step, the plant and go, the 3-step, the triangle, the goose, all the fancy things we talk about. But at the end of the day, like, I have to learn to put that into practice at variable speeds and variable timings. And my cues for that are spatial, like based on what I'm seeing, what I'm reading, how fast I'm moving, how fast you're moving, and what my capabilities are. Well, that makes it sound really confusing, like it's unlearnable. We go, no, it's actually really, really learnable. Mm-hmm. You know what you got to do? You got to do it. Like, you got to, like, we should be, every practice for every sport should be having some sort of one-on-one box drill where it's like, you beat that person, you try to stay in front of them, and that's it. And like, we should be doing that, I think, in every sport, every day. Like, people just need repetitions.
That was Andy Ryland, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Lost Empire Herbs, and I want to share with you how to get a free bag of pine pollen through Lost Empire here today. Quickly first, I used to think herbs was just ginkgo biloba you got at the drugstore, but after being introduced to compounds such as the Phoenix formula through Lost Empire, I've been a regular consumer of Lost Empire herbs for over 4 years now. The Phoenix formula instantly changed my viewpoint on herbalism. I was literally buzzing with energy after my first dose. Within 2 weeks, I was noticing strength improvements in the weight room, and it's been fun expanding my herbalism regime to different things throughout the Lost Empire Herbs store. In Phoenix formula in particular, along with Shilajit, which is a very popular herb for strength and performance, you also have pine pollen, which is a superfood. It offers a variety of energy, health, and performance benefits. And you can grab that free bag of pine pollen with the modest cost of shipping by heading to justflypinepollen.com. If you want to check out other herbs that I enjoy through Lost Empire, you can head to lostempireherbs/justfly and grab 15% off your order. I can't recommend Lost Empire enough, and I really enjoy the fact that I've been able to partner with them through this podcast for as long as I have. So be sure to check that out. Let's get on to the rest of the show. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to get this show going, and welcome back Andy Ryland to the podcast. He was a guest way back on episode 170, where he spoke on a humans first, athletes second, and specialist third approach to athlete development. Andy is the senior manager of education and training at USA Football. He's been there since 2010. Andy has consulted with programs at every level of competition and is an expert on the developmental and skill building process for athletes. In the world of sport, things can get very dissected and compartmentalized, and I think it's always good to be making connections between the skill building pieces and more of the raw physical pieces. The more we can zoom out, I believe the better our intuition can get in that total process of athlete development. On today's episode, Andy digs into key points on the art of athletic skill building. A primary piece of this is how he runs the whole part whole system, which can be applied to football and team sports. It can also be applied to speed training or more raw athletic movement qualities. It can be taken into the weight room. Andy will also discuss microdosing of skills or prescriptive extras in the scope of sport. He'll cover key aspects of improving agility, game speed. He'll talk about creativity and intuition in coaching, and much more. It's awesome talking to Andy. I love seeing his lens on athletic development, and I'm excited to get you guys this show. Let's get to episode 366 here with Coach Andy Ryland. Andy, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here. And you were just mentioning you had started watching, is it a new American Gladiators series or something? Or is it rerun? Or I wasn't sure, but you were talking about that here.
So there's a documentary on the original American Gladiators. And I think it was on HBO, but I caught like the last couple of episodes in a hotel traveling for work, like always. And then it just came to Netflix. So I started the first episode last night. I fell asleep, didn't get to finish the episode, but it's like the background of American Gladiators. And actually what's really interesting is the first episode, they're talking about the pilot and how like the games they did in the pilot were terrible, but they were just like making them up as they went, and they were trying to figure it out. And then they got it sold. And then they you bring in some other people in minds. And eventually it became like the games that we know as American Gladiators, if you're an adult of our age who grew up with that. But it was just kind of really interesting where we were talking about Powerball from Jeremy Fresh, but this first episode, they talk about, like I said, like they invented these games, and some of them worked and some of them didn't, but they were trying to create the show, and how ridiculous the pilot was because the games were so bad. But then ultimately you look at the final product and there's some really cool things in there. Like, shoot, as a kid, tell me you didn't want to do the obstacle course. So like that creative process of creating games and what works and what doesn't, like, is really brought to life. And it's, just kind of funny to see it through this lens of my childhood memories.
Yeah, same here. I was going to ask what, and I'll have to watch it, but like what some of the failed games were. I mean, it just fits with anything in business and life. You have to fail and you have to do things that didn't work out before you can find those things that stick and kind of, I mean, I think too, the things that kind of just resonate with us as well, just from a basis of play. But do you remember some of the ones that they did that didn't work out?
So the original Powerball, and this will actually be funny because of, like, you'll see this in strength and conditioning quite a bit. But the original Powerball, instead of like blocking and tackling to keep them away from the goal, they were in the harnesses, and so that, like, as the ball carrier ran this way, the gladiator would run the opposite direction, and like the harness pull. And you'll see, like you said, in a lot of off seasons, guys doing those harness pulls as competitions or finishers or whatever. And so the original one, it was a little less contact and a little more about pulling and driving. Eventually it became what it became. They had a wacky one which like the contestants wore a Velcro suit, and like the gladiators were throwing them like, and they bounced off of these Velcro walls. And if they got stuck, like, supposedly that's how many points they got. And so there's like good places to get stuck and bad places to get stuck, as the gladiator guy is chucking this poor little dude around the scene. They had one on the trampoline, which is like a game my daughters would play, but they were trying to collect foam pieces off of the trampoline while the gladiator was jumping on the mat to make everything bounce around and hard to grab. But then there was also like a handle you could pull, and that would like shoot the contestant up in the air because it was attached to a bungee. And I mean, just wild stuff, but trying to figure out, hey, how do we make this competition? And then, like, I don't know who came up with human cannonball in the end, where they swing and smash each other. But it was just an evolution of trying to do stuff. And who would have known the Velcro suit game didn't make it to the finals?
The Velcro, I feel like the Velcro suit thing is kind of written into our collective unconscious a little bit, because I saw something like that in Jackass, where they like jumped off a trampoline and there was a truck going by, and they had like a sticky suit, and were trying to stick onto the truck or something like that. But I also kind of feel like the writers of the show, the gladiators, you would think must have been like, hey, can we do this? Can we try this with the contestants or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just chucking this dude around who's like on a bungee, so like it made it even easier to toss around. And it didn't work because no one stuck to the Velcro suit. They just ended up banging off the wall in this little contraption of a game. So, but like all coaches, right, we've all tried drills or activities that either needed a tweak or went in the trash pile fairly quick.
Yeah, even in just the sake of raw speed training and not even like more open-ended play games and reacting. Chris Corfus was just talking on the last podcast about how many practices he would try something, and on the way back he's like, oh, that didn't work. But it's the exploration, though. You have to be willing to explore things and be creative, and then you go, was that a good idea? Was it not a good idea? But maybe I can even skip forward a few questions in the sense of, you had mentioned, and I think this could go for anything. I think this could go for sports skill or even strength and conditioning, because I'll do this in the warm-ups all the time, where it's more of a little more creative, open-ended warm-up. We'll start with a few parameters. I know what the eventual goal of the session is going to be from a raw strength perspective, but how we get there is not 100% fixed. And I was going to ask you what your thought is on, just in general, if you're doing skill work, skill development, team development, play, what your thoughts are in terms of like creativity and going with intuition versus having more of a set structural framework for practice.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting question, because, if I think if you go to Wooden's, not his pyramid, but his 8 principles of coaching, like never change the practice plan is one of them. You know what I mean? Like, you've done all the work, you've thought about it, and you've changed it. But like, and if you see something that's wrong, like just put it in the next day's practice plan. And I think a lot of people feel very much similar to that. They like the structure. It adds some comfort to it. I think for me, there's like a great space kind of in between that keeps people happy, where you're programming the space. So it's not like you're completely going off script, but you're programming the space. And specifically for skills, and again, I work mostly in the tackle, so it makes a lot of sense. But I'm a huge whole part whole guy, and I'll be the first to tell you the part aspect is never scripted because it's like we're doing to do this, a moderate level tackle activity or a high level tackle activity. And then we're going to do this kind of coaching intervention. We're going to go do the part, right? We're going to strip it down a little bit. I love the open-ended skill stuff, as much as anybody, but sometimes there's some time to get back to some technique or reminder of a few little KPIs or things like that. And so that part aspect of whole part whole is always open-ended. It's like if our arms are terrible, if our leg drive is terrible, if our strike accuracy is terrible, well, that's going to be my part. And I'm going to be creative and adaptive and read the players on that day and that's going to be the part. So like for me, that's a great example of I use a whole part whole system for a 5-minute block of practice, a 10-minute block of practice, whatever it is. I know what I want to get to, but I'm also going to read like, hey, the first 3 minutes we go through, I'm reading it and I'm totally adjusting on the fly to like, all right, our arms are terrible today, boys. Like we're going to this drill. We're going to get 2 quick minutes of this. Here's our reminders, like feel that pattern. You know what I mean? Understand what we're looking for. Now let's go put it back in the full drill again. And so I think something like that can be, really useful. We're even in a team situation. You're creating like, I don't know, I have a 20-minute team block, and in between there's like a 5-minute corrections period where I don't know going into practice what we're going to need to fix, but we're going to run some plays. We're going to do some stuff. And it could be, again, any sport, soccer, basketball, football, lacrosse. But all of a sudden I'm seeing like our picks are terrible or our cuts through, you know what I mean? And so then we're going to do that little microdose coaching intervention on that thing. And if I'm doing a really good job, my coaching intervention part aspect is going to be not like some super stereotyped copy and paste drill that's been done since the dawn of time. It's who are my athletes? What are they struggling with? What is the situation that they're struggling with in it? And then how can I kind of replicate that before we go back into the full thing? So I guess it's structure and, that gives you a base of kind of calmness and I know where we're going, but also like there's blocks where I know my coach's eye and my problem solving capabilities are going to be highly needed and are going to dictate what this 3-minute block is, what that 5-minute block is, and what we work on here at the end of the day.
Yeah, that definitely makes good sense. It makes me think too, I mean, I know with my track and field background in coaching, and this isn't like football or basketball per se, but even in something like coaching the javelin throw, I would commonly find myself, the hole, it would be the throw. And then in between throws, I would put together, I'd be like, okay, this athlete or this throw looked like that. Hey, why don't you go ahead and do this specific drill for 10 or 15 reps, and then before you go do your next throw again. It was very, very open-ended. It's not scripted. It's just, hey, here's what I saw on the competition day. And it's a little bit different, I think, in track versus a sport with a lot more chaos to it and moving parts to it. But that was a simple way that I would put that
I think
together.
that's a great example, though, because, I think 2 different athletes in an event, it could be the run up, it could be kind of that torque and, the hip shoulder aspect, or it could be something with your arm and your release. And so it's like what 3 individuals need is very different. And so again, large groups can be difficult, but if I have a manageable number, well, I can pair them up. Hey, you 2 are the release group. You 2 are the run up group. And I want you to come over here with me and we're going to work on that torque and that, that hip loading or whatever it is. And it's like those little micro corrections, little micro scales, can very easily be prescriptive within that. And then to your point, like, hey, we do the drills, like now you feel it in your hips now, like you kind of got that anchored in. All right, let's have a couple more throws, see if you can find it within the full thing again. And then beautiful. Hey, thumbs up, thumbs down. Do we need more? Can we move on to something different? So I think it works in a lot of sports where I can see the same thing, like where, we're doing a start and it's like someone's heel recovery versus someone else's arms. You know what I mean? It's like, all right, cool. Here's your micro skills, your fix, and that whole style. Does it have to be written on your practice plan with the specific times, or is it just the idea that, like, again, coming from that skill acquisition side, I think me and you both we like it bigger and more open, and then just those little bite-sized pieces, and then we come back to it. I really think that's the way to go. And a lot of coaches that I've spoke to have really bought into it, where they're like, oh my gosh, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Where it's like, yeah, maybe in football, I watched the film and I know what we did wrong last game. So I'm thinking I want to work on those. But then also there's kind of those day-to-day, week-to-week performances where it's like something else slides off. You know what I mean? We're focused so much on thing one that now I'm not happy with thing two. All right, cool. We have these great little microdose opportunities. 100%. Like I said, I think the coach's eye is the most important factor in it, where it's like, if I can see, especially live, like in our team sports, when we always want to go back to the film and correct it later that evening. But it's like, if I can see it live and make those little micro adjustments and give those little coaching interventions, if you will, like, I think you're much better off making progress on the day.
Yeah, I agree. That, I think what you're saying too does highlight, I mean, I look at all iterations of sport and movement sharing a same common philosophy, but I do think something like, let's say, strength and conditioning versus sport. Sport is more chaotic by nature than doing a deadlift or something like that. I think that, I mean, and you can be doing, like, you could do, like, you know, various correctives in between main lifts in the weight room, even for the sake of something I would say is more discrete, let's say speed, because I think that's a little bit more applicable if we're talking about raw outputs. Like, with the Chris Corfus, to go back to his podcast, I think he had so many good ideas with what he was talking about that I got my wheels turning. But he would have his athletes do a core sprint, and then they do their weakness in between. And it wasn't, everyone didn't do the same drill for their weakness. And that was so key. It's like, all right, here's my stompers, here's my slicers. The stompers are doing this drill, the slicers are doing this one. And it was also in higher reps. So like the main speed movement might have been shorter, but then the weakness builder was longer. And so it just allowed people to get a lot of reps in for their weakness. And I think in the gym, or for me, how I treat things in the weight room is more from the perspective of, because it's a little different than sport, I more look at it a lot of times in terms of the athlete's attention and engagement. That's how I'm using my creativity there, is like, okay, is this series of drills, maybe we're doing like some dodges or dodging action with the dowel rod, they're jumping over the dowel rod, or they're ducking under it, or they're doing different movements, they're doing rolls over it. Okay, they're getting a little bit bored with this one, let's advance them to the next tier that's getting them a little bit closer to the main lifts we're going to be doing. So that's more where I think it works in that more generalized aspect for me. I mean, I just think skill development and creativity and intuition can go pretty much anywhere you are working with athletes. It can go anywhere. So I'm always trying to draw all those places out. But I do find it interesting how you're talking about John Wooden, and obviously amazing, brilliant, legendary coach, right? But talking about, oh, it should be scripted. But I think sometimes, I mean, we all have different personalities too. Some of us are more comfortable in chaos. Some of us are more scripted I think a lot of times people who are more scripted maybe become strength coaches as opposed to sport coaches, but I'm not sure. I don't think I've talked to enough people in that regards. But it is interesting to think about that. I do think about what Sam Portland had said about coaching being a conversation. I think regardless of what the medium you are in, coaching is a conversation. If you wrote it all ahead of time and there's never a change, then it's not a conversation anymore. So I'd be curious to sit on Wooden's practice too, and maybe there's some nuances that went outside of that, you know, that were much different in that regard.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, where it's like they're, you know, in the conversation, and it goes back to kind of the coach's eye, where your visual cues, like that's the information oftentimes you're getting back from the athlete. Now, obviously, we hope you're having open relationships, you're developing good things, all that, where you can talk back and forth, how you feeling today, what's this and that. But, you know, the old, like the warm up is the best, you know, movement screen kind of idea. Like if you're seeing those things, but it's not just the warm up, like it's also the performance on the day, you know, like where I think about myself as I'm getting older now, right? Like I can go into the gym and I have a deadlift day, which is going to be trap bar for me because I'm old and my back doesn't like it. But like some days, you know what I mean? Like I feel like I'm really struggling to get down to my hips. And some days I feel like I'm, you know, it's my back is the issue. So it's like those little correctives or what I'm doing in between sets, like absolutely is different day to day, because it's like, I don't know, maybe I went for a hike over the weekend with the kids and it's like my calves are just really tight. And I feel like that's my issue, you know? And so it's like, well, yeah, there's not necessarily one thing. Sometimes you just you gotta feel it, or you gotta see it, and you gotta work on some different stuff. But I'll throw another one out there where you were talking about the Chris Corfus correctives. So my mentor, Richie Gray, is a guy who has worked in professional international rugby for ages now. And he talked about they had a thing where they had prescriptive extras. They called them work-ons, but every athlete had their work-ons that fit their game. And the simple rule was they put out like a set of bags, like on the kind of right by the entrance to the field. And it was kind of like a buy in, buy out in the kind of the strength and conditioning world or whatever. But their rule was you can't pass the bags. And every athlete had like their 3 or 4 drills, and they were supposed to get like, I don't know, 5 to 10 reps or every day of their particular weaknesses. So when they jogged out on the field before practice, they'd find a partner and they just hit, their little work-ons that I need to work on. And we took that to football and we published it in some of our tackle materials, but it's like, it's a great way to get with your players and like do some individual evaluation, get some kind of prescriptive extras, and just say like, okay, each day, you know what I mean? Like if you gave every player 2 to 3 drills and 3 to 5 reps, like not anything that's going to throw off the balance of practice, and said before or after practice, I want you to find a partner and do these things. And obviously I'm using 3 to 5 because we're talking about a contact scale here. But like you need to do low tackle on the bag, 5 reps. And I want you to do this open field tracking, this and then. Players are just kind of mixing and matching. And it's like, oh, who else is in the open field group? Oh, okay. Yeah. Come over here. I'm with you. Oh, you're in the power group. Like then you partner up with Billy and you just kind of do your work. And it's really simple, because as a coach, you're not having to do the whole team. You just do your little position group. You give everybody 3 to 5 reps and they just find those extra spaces in between before, after practice to do the work. And I have a buddy who coaches out in Oregon, who puts all the equipment out in center field, like right where the logo is, and they just set their camera on the logo. And the secret, don't tell him, but he says he doesn't check it. He just tells them that it's like that they start before when practice. When the student goes up there, they start the camera and everybody just filters through. And as they come out at different times, they just get their reps in. And so that's how they do their kind of individual work. And I think it goes right into that S&C side of like, we typically have the knee group, the hip group, the shoulder group, but there's also space for fillers and changes and day-to-days on like what you might need to do or where you're feeling.
It makes me think too about Mark McLaughlin was talking about, I think it was maybe it was like zone 0. It wasn't block 0. It was like zone 0. Like you have the heart rates like zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he was talking about, I believe it was zone 0 in the sense of like, you could just say, instead of sitting there between sets in the gym, walking or something. But I think about, but I think that could be, I think there was other applications of it as well, far beyond walking. But I think about, well, if you want to really maximize the use of all your time, and I do think sometimes just sitting around, it depends on the context for sure. I think in the gym, a different context, more likely, if you're all just sitting around waiting to lift a heavy weight, I think that's a little bit different than something that is very specifically attuned to skill and chaos and more that fine skill building. But I look at it like kind of like, if you compare, like Ethan Reeve talked about the gym as he sees the gym through the eyes of a wrestling coach. I often see it through the eyes of a track coach. And I try to coach, coaching youth soccer as well, and just different sport variations is really enjoyable. But I do think that if the ultimate goal of a session is skill building the same way you perceive it when you play, then you're always going to want to be doing something. And if nothing else, kind of staying in that mental space too of not checking out. Like having something to do is going to keep you in that mental space where you aren't checking out of it. And you're always maybe you're a higher proportion of staying in flow state as well. Just always kind of having something that's task oriented in front of you.
It's funny you say that because for me, and just me personally, like I came from a high intensity lifting program in college, the one set failure kind of deal. And so I've always struggled with rest times. And so if I had like a 3-minute rest prescribed, I would be going nuts. When I first made the transition. And so like, I would always find myself like, okay, I have heavy squat, then I have, a 4-minute rest and another heavy squat. At 2 minutes, I'd be like doing some body weight reps where I'm like grooving my technique and like doing that. And part of it was like, I felt like it was too long to wait. And I just wanted to bend my knees a little bit, but in some other sense, I'm also like, maybe there is some like, some extra learning, some micro reps. I'm grooving that technique. Yes, it's completely different as soon as I put that, big weight on my shoulder, but like, there's things in there that you can do. I've used the example of like the traditional on-field max speed, exposure, hamstring kind of, training, hey, we got to hit our max speed once a week to protect those hamstrings, but that means we're going to take those long rests. And I was always like, well, that rest doesn't have to be like complete rest. And if I'm doing it really well, there's a great integration with the sport coach where like we could do some tactical lectures, if you will, but like we could walk around the field. So if I do my sprint and I have a 4-minute rest, a 6-minute rest, if I'm a soccer coach, like we could go down into our defensive zone and be like, okay, like when we're here, like our exit strategy is XYZ and blah, blah, blah. And then we walk over to the midfield and we're saying, defensive side of the midfield, like we're thinking this, we want to take some chances. We're going to play the long ball. Oh, okay, here you guys go, 1 minute till your next sprint. We walk down, we hit our max effort. Then we walk into the attacking zone and we talk about what our plan is. So it's like, you can use that as a like tactical teaching for your game upcoming. Like you don't just have to stand there. Football, it works great. Like you in between those max effort sprints, like why not, again, walking, resting, but why not align in your formations? Why not talk through like, okay, when here and the motion, we're going to check to this coverage. So it's like the idea that it has to be one thing and that we can't fill those spaces with some more creativity or some learning. And I remember, oh gosh, it was a podcast. It may have been a Pacey Performance podcast way back, but like they were talking to some rugby coaches and they would talk about trying to steal skill reps in the gym. And so they would talk to the S&Cs about like, if this activity is not going to fatigue the athlete and take away from the performance, like, would you mind if we stole some reps? So like in between a heavy squat, they may do like a stationary passing drill where each guy's going to get 15 passes off both right and left hand. And like, it's not going to take away from the lower body fatigue and they're still going to have great power output. But like, we can use that rest time as a little mini skill session. And then okay, it's upper body day. We don't want to do this, but like we can do X and try how they tried to work this program. And I wish I remembered which one of the teams, but one of the super rugby teams out of Australia. And I found it a really interesting concept of like, why can't we do non-competing like skill exercises in between those things if we felt like we can manage the fatigue effectively.
Yeah, I love that. It's kind of funny because I think and so often things are siloed out so that like I think in the NCAA you probably like couldn't do that. I don't think you would be allowed to do like football reps in between the whatever the rules are, right? Like there's so much separation a lot of times in that. But I think about track and field, that's always right there because a lot of track stuff is also weight room stuff technically. Like you could do Olympic lifts and bounding variations and superset that, or even light. A lot of times I'll superset Olympic stuff with light bounding variations just to kind of keep, well, one, I think it's just a natural good pair, but it also always kind of keeps in your mind of stay elastic, stay light, stay rhythmic. If you're a jumper, that's it. And one of the things that I really liked, and I think in so many ways, it's hard to explain this. It's something you kind of have to experience more. But when I went to Rafe Kelly's return to the Source Retreat, they talked about, and I think this was Aaron Cantor, who is one of the EMP coaches. We did a lot like roughhousing stuff. And within the roughhousing, they talked about the inner game and the outer game. And I think so often we only look at the outer game, like the big external thing that we address more intellectually, versus the inner game are like more the subtle things that we can't just think our way through. We can't just put logic in our head and just straight up think our way through it. There has to be, and I think that's the distinguishing feature of so many elite athletes. They can do what you can't, not because they're thinking about it more. They just have it. Something is in their inner game that they have. Of course, they have physical gifts too, and various physical, maybe, arm lengths and structures and things that are really important. But at the end of the day, there's those subtle inner nuances that you can't just intellectualize as well. I do think like the strategy, talking about formation strategy, I guess I get back to Richard Eschevas was talking about like the different ways you go about a workout. You have the strategy, which is intellectualizing, but then you also have like a more emotional part of it that you get to, like working out, it might be like like when you're really getting into deep sets, you're not strategizing now. You're in a kind of a more of a fight mode and it's more emotional, but it is needless to say, I was just, as you were talking, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of going all over the place, but I was thinking it's like there's always this interplay or wave. Everything is based off a wave. And I think the wave, a really helpful wave, as I've seen it is a wave that waves between the outer game, the big external thing, and then something that waves down into more the inner game that allows you to work with that part of your system and then go back to the outer game. And, is something as simple as like a physical output, like a sprint or jump and a bound, like something more like an explosive Olympic lifts more outer, something that's more subtle, like a higher rep bounding, for fluidity is more inner. I'll do the same thing with like 3-way hip circles and a hex deadlift, just stuff like that. But you just got me thinking about that, because I think we do naturally do that. I've seen correctives, correctives are given all the time between like main lifts and things like that. But I also think there's something that goes deeper than we'll just do this corrective. There's also like a chance to kind of work a different part of your mental structure as well, if that makes sense.
No. And so it's like a simple example, right? But in football, there's like these little punching machines. It's like a little body and it attaches to a power rack, and they're really pretty common. And like, it would be very common for a football workout that like in between some of your sets that you're going to go over and you're going to get your strikes. But in the same sense, it's still that gross outer high level. And it's like, well, but you also have like 60 people in the room. You could partner up and do like a little refitting, a little hand battle. You know what I mean? Like, especially if the guys are mature enough, like in their development, that they can, manage tempo a little bit. Like, it doesn't have to be a one-on-one blocking drill, but you can like do a ton of really cool stuff. And for me, within the contact space, one of the things I value most is just feel, proprioception. You know what I mean? Like, I think we talked about last time, inside of the contact zone, like when I'm engaged with you, very little of the information I'm getting is visual. It's a lot of it is feel. Like, are you trying to push me straight back, or are you trying to turn my shoulders and twist me one way or the other to open up a gap or a hole? And how I brace and fight is going to be based on not just that your hands are on me, but which way are you trying to turn me and or push me? And so I have to adjust my lower body, my brace angles to be able to push back and meet force with force and fight that. Well, how do I develop, or how do I find ways to steal lots of reps of people leaning on me, so I'm developing a feel for where these angles are? And it's not just like two people running straight into each other, because again, am I trying to drive you back? Am I trying to end up working my hips and move you laterally, or am I trying to twist you? That's 3 different aspects I have within that one collision. And so I value that proprioception feel so much that I think a lot of the prep for contact stuff now is that, like I've been preaching, it's just based on like, because of the off-season rules, and we're not supposed to do football activities, but I can still expose you to that roughhousing environment. And then obviously with the kids, like, just that roughhousing is such like a robust stimulus. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so good for that global development, where it's like, you need interacting with another human being. You need how to learn how to be strong versus an outside force. You need to learn how to be balanced and agile versus an outside force. Like, in a lot of sports, could be a soccer player who's trying to get cut off, a basketball player, trying to turn the corner and get to the hoop, or a football player in contact. Can you remain athletic versus this outside force, this person leaning on you, whether it's football and I can punch you, or it's basketball or soccer and I have to use the hips? How do I stay athletic around these forces? Well, that's one of those things that, like, I can tell you that, but like, that's conceptualizing it is not anywhere close to being able to do it. And so at some point, we just need to create opportunities for you to find that idea within your own body. I can plant the seed, you know what I mean? And maybe I can give you some ideas of things that have helped in the past, or there are some practices that seem to be pretty successful. But even if I do a great job teaching it, there's going to be this phase of you having to learn it in your own body. You have to take those words and put them into actions. And then those actions are going to be variable based on how aggressive or non-aggressive or big or strong or small the person who's pushing you is, and what's the appropriate reaction. Well, the best way, like, I can't coach that from the press box. Like, you have to feel that. And therefore, I want to build lots of pattern recognition, lots of a database, all that kind of good stuff. Let's get reps. Let's build it so that you feel these things and know. And to your point, now I'm not consciously thinking about it. Like, I'm just feeling opportunities and then taking them as they come, without consciously, having to say like, oh, it's A gap, B gap, boom here. It's like, oh no, there's the force. That's actually really weak. I can walk right through that. I'm just going to go ahead and take it. I don't think that, but that's after the play. That's probably what I'm, kind of reconciling to myself as why I did that.
You got me thinking now. And you mentioned the roughhousing with the younger athletes. I'd like to ask you how you integrate that. But I had this thought. My son is I coach my son's soccer team. He just turned 5, and I was like, well, if I'm still coaching it, his boys team when they're 7 or 8, what if we just like played soccer and then wrestled and then played soccer and wrestled? But I don't think the league would let me do that, but that would be amazing. And then I wonder what their playing style would end up being. But that could be I'm sure that I'm curious, with football, how do you integrate roughhousing with the younger athletes, and then how does that progress up through their older ages?
So, and I think this goes back to some of that earlier conversation about the structuralism, is that not sounding like the grumpy old guy, but with less free play opportunities, I think youth coaches, and we could go up as far as you need based on the developmental abilities of your athletes, but coaches sometimes have to manufacture those free play opportunities that helped develop general skills in the past. And I always use the example of if you look at these olden football films, back in the day, they were doing a lot of calisthenics, the old monkey rolls and bear, and they're doing their jumps and their hops and their quarter turns. There's a lot of calisthenic-y type stuff in there. But then you realize those athletes also weren't really full-time professionals. A lot of them had off-season jobs and were selling cars or working, at the local school or whatever. And then they showed up for camp, even though they were playing in the NFL. I think at some point in professionalism, those things got demonized as not football specific. And when athletes maybe were part of these higher level year-round training programs, they did come in with the movement skills and movement bases where you could spend more time on skills because those other buckets were being filled by this really year-round training. I start to worry, and that our modern society, for all kinds of reasons, PE, gym class, we tend to be a little more litigious. Parents don't want their kids doing certain activities on the playground. The idea that maybe we're just going to kick our kids out at 9 o'clock in the morning and tell them, don't come home till lunch, just go play. That we don't do that. We got to keep an eye on them. That they've lost those free play opportunities, meaning when they get to sport, we go, oh, that's not football specific. But if they don't have the movement kind of foundations, the movement database that past generations had, then it's very specific to their development. And so I believe all youth coaches now really have to spend some time doing that. In our official USA football practice plans, there's a 5 to 10 minute period every day where we call athlete development, where it's jumping, it's cutting, it's landing, it's grappling, it's tumbling, it's rolling. It's something in that general skill thing where we're investing time in the underpinning physical qualities that are actually going to help them learn the skill later on because they have some movement capacities. Within the contact stuff, I'm a big fan of obviously crawling and tumbling. Contact sport, you need to have tools and methods and be confident in going to the ground. If you're uncomfortable going to the ground, there's going to be a lot of situations that you choose not to engage in the sport. Maybe it's a shortstop diving for a ground ball. Maybe it's a soccer player, really going into a tackle, sliding. There's a football player who's what, I'm going to stay out of that pile because I don't like what happens at the end of this thing. Well, if I have the tools and some strategies and I'm comfortable going to ground in a multitude of ways, guess what? I'll look much more aggressive, because I'm I can handle it. I know what's going to come. And if I go down, I'm going to be able to tumble, or I'm going to be able to judo fall, or I'm going to be able to parachute fall. I have a tool to do it. So love the tumbling because we do that. Crawling, just obviously core strength, great shoulder work, great cross crawl pattern stuff. I'm big on it for the core aspects, and not just core strength and core stability, but in a contact sports, two of the traits that I think are most important and most underrated and talked about is that spinal awareness and then postural, manipulation. So if I can't feel when my back is flat or my back is rounded or my back is arched, your coaching cues don't matter. That kid is in that terrible position and you're no, make your back flat. He thinks it is because he can't feel the difference between those three positions. Well, so I need to get him really integrated into those things, and crawling tends to put us in some challenging postural positions where we're learning what flat feels like, what strong and solid feels like, or when I start to fall apart and it gets wonky. And so I really value that because I think it supports all the safety teaching later about head, neck, spine, body positions as we enter the contact. And then the grappling aspect, I mean, to really make it short, any push-pull game is going to be massive for kids working on like dynamic balance versus outside forces, psychologically getting comfortable inside other people's personal spaces, being able to give and receive forces, and hopefully like for as we higher level, can I give and receive forces without, like overextending or throwing myself out of posture? Again, the analogy, like I have this great overhand right as a boxer, but if every time I throw it, I'm completely out of balance and fully elongated and, you know what I mean, like in a terrible position, then I get caught with a counter every time, and that's not real good. So can I use these push-pull forces and keep in good position so that I can quickly engage in the next activity? So it could be something as simple as like, standing across from each other on the line, and we grasp hands in any number of different ways, grasp wrists, whatever. And you have to try to pull your partner across the line, or you have to try to push, yourself across the line, and they have to push back. And we may do it hand to hand. We may do it hand to body. We may say, okay, now you're only allowed to use one hand. Now you can't use any hands. It's all shoulder and chest, and you have to learn to use your body to manipulate another body. We're going to do it side to side. We're going to do it back to back. We're just getting in these push-pull battles, like to keep it as simple as possible. Let your imagination run wild, in which I have to generate force. I have to feel force and brace against it to hold my position, or I have to find the ability to like squeeze isometrically, fight that force, and not break down in postures. I start to learn things really quickly about, if my feet are directly under me when someone's pushing me, like I have a tendency to go back. If I can get my feet back and create a little bit of positive shin angle, guess what? I can lean against that and hold myself here pretty good. So we're going to do a lot of that. And then for our tackle sports specifically, like the ability to control another human being with your arms, kind of the traditional wrap up aspect of a tackle. We call it clamp because it sounds cool, and like squeeze and crush and all that kind of stuff. Kids like it. But learning to control someone with my arms for sports that allow it, jiu-jitsu, wrestling, judo, rugby, football, then we'll add in that aspect. Whereas if I'm just working with, say, a soccer basketball player, we're probably not going to use our arms quite as much. In the sport specific side, we're going to be mostly based on hips and shoulders, because those are kind of the weapons I'm allowed to use to try to move someone on the field in those sports. So those are always going to be part of our athletic development session. And then I use them very specifically as a specialized warm-up before we would do any like collision skills. So before we would go into tackle work, we're going to do some push-pull battle games. So I'm kind of like getting the body switched on, getting that core, that balance, that spatial awareness, like kind of queued up a little bit, so that when we go into our tackle work, you know what I mean? Like we're ready for that. And we're also building those underpinnings. And I really think it helps, like I said, a better performance when, like I said, just like doing a good warm up in the weight room or hitting your warm up sets on the bar, like we try not to jump to, 90%. So it's like, let's try not to do like, hey, do your hamstring kicks, do your lunges, right? Great dynamic warm up. Now run into each other full speed. Like, whoa, there was a jump. Like maybe I should do a little bit of that to get myself moving.
Yeah, it makes sense and I think about it, like what you're saying, it's like there's things that you have to feel that you can't just intellectually explain to somebody. Like anything with grappling, anything with feeling your rib cage in space. Think about even so many fast 40-yard, 20-yard, 10-meter fly times come right after playing, if you're playing like a soccer game or something, and then, all right, we're playing soccer, now go run the 10 flyer, now go run the 40, instead of a typical, all right, we're going to do all these A skips and B skips and linear lunges and all these, all these things that are a little bit more, that could be very intellectual on their own. It's like, all right, here, pick this drill, now do it just like this, put your arm and leg here, and then versus, hey, go play soccer. And now it's not like you're thinking about that stuff while you're playing soccer, but your body is doing so much of what it needs to automatically. And it's just, a lot of this stuff is automatic, and that's what the beauty of it. It's not complicated. It's like wired into us.
And we call them, like primers, and like we talk about, kind of getting the body, queued up and ready to go. Like I do think there's some nervous system stuff, but about like when the bandwidth of the warm up is really small, versus like when I get into this push pull grapple thing, like there's other aspects that are being engaged and lit up. You know what I mean? Like, and now I'm it's not just my hip flexor and my hamstring because I did, this purely linear sprint thing. And yes, I want those fully ready to go, but I feel like I'm also getting to some other stuff here that's helping to light me up. And like, I feel good. I feel ready. I'm ready to go. Why? Because I did some cool stuff that like, got into other areas that now I'm cued on. I'm feeling different parts of my body like a little bit better. Like I said, I'm really locked into where I'm at. To your point about like, are you feeling your rib cage? Are you feeling your arms? Like I remember the first time as a college athlete when like we were doing, like conditioning work or whatever, but like could actually feel that I was like pushing back, and it felt like the turf was bunching behind my foot on the acceleration phase. It was like people have told me this for 6 years. And I still remember the light bulb moment because it was during conditioning. It wasn't even a sprint day, but I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm actually feeling that drive back through my forefoot. Like I'm feeling, and it was a huge light bulb moment for me. And so those moments are massive, I think, for everyone. And even if you don't consciously make the connection the way I did, because I was 20 years old, like that repetition in that database still allows for those unconscious things before, because at the end of the day, we're answering the question, have I been there before? And it's like, oh yeah, like that is a huge bridge to cross.
Yeah. To learn things as well, even, with the roll, you mentioned the rolling. I think about things that are learned that are difficult to teach or process, like intellectually, like, would you teach someone a roll or a dive roll and say, all right, you're going to put this segment of your spine on the ground, then you're going to put this on the ground, then you're going to, that you wouldn't, it operates under a little different context. And I just think it's interesting. A lot of times people assume because someone went to a university or has a certification that, well, they're going to be able to fix this thing. And it's like, well, this thing isn't just, there is intellectual, training design and creating constraints and leading the athlete. Like, there's a lot of intellectual things that go in that process, but the whole base of the pyramid was a lot of things that you didn't intellectualize that you just felt and did. And maybe you had those like Satori, like eureka moments, like you were saying with figuring out what your foot was doing in the sprint and things like that. And so I just find that interesting, that the way that we often approach things versus how we, the natural learning process that happens.
I think a great example of that is kind of our agility stuff, where space and timing is completely, to me, like it's a personal thing based on how explosive I am, right? Hey, I'm really muscular driven. You're really bouncy and kind of tendon driven, or, using the stereotypes. And like, so the space in which we need to initiate our cut is going to be different because I'm slow and I'm that big push guy and you're just super bouncy. Okay, awesome. So we all have different space and timing. So can a coach coach my space and timing? Well, he can help guide me through the process, but like I kind of got to learn some of those things. And you can teach me the jump cut, the crossover step, the plant and go, the 3-step, the triangle, the goose, all the fancy things we talk about. But at the end of the day, like I have to learn to put that into practice at variable speeds and variable timings. And my cues for that are spatial, like based on what I'm seeing, what I'm reading, how fast I'm moving, how fast you're moving, and what my capabilities are. Well, that makes it sound really confusing, like it's unlearnable. We go, no, it's actually really, really learnable. Mm-hmm. You know what you got to do? You got to do it. Like you got to, like we should be, every practice for every sport should be having some sort of one-on-one box drill where it's like you beat that person, you try to stay in front of them, and that's it. And like we should be doing that, I think, in every sport, every day. Like people just need repetitions, because most sports at the end of the day, we call it tracking and evasion. But like, can I evade you and can you track me down and stay in front of me? Whether that's any field sport in transition, whether that's football in a one-on-one situation or a tackle situation, whether that's basketball players doing it while trying to dribble. At the end of the day, like those are the things we're trying to do, right? Create space, close down space, evade my opponent, track and close the opponent. But that's the thing we probably train least. And we often train the tools, i.e. like this cut. We're going to use this spin move. We're going to use this jump cut. But the timing aspect is the absolute key. And to your point earlier, that's one of those things that we can't really intellectualize. Like
Yeah.
it's a concept that I can guide you around and, hey, you got to do that earlier. Hey, try to do it later. You gave him too much time to recover. But ultimately, you have to know your spacings. And the only way you do that is experiential. So lots of tracking evasion games, like with a ball, without a ball, like I do tons of football stuff. And people always ask, like, why don't you use a ball? And I'm like, because that's the least important aspect is whether, the guy has a ball or not. It's about, can I stay in front of him? Can I close down the space? Like you could carry anything, you know what I mean? But at the end of the day, if I have that skill set, like I'll be okay. So it's a great example of like a physical development thing that you can't really teach. You have to create environments and then exposure for, but also is a huge underpinning thing, because I could give you all the tackle technique in the world. If you can't win the space and get there in the first place, like you're going to be in trouble. Or, hey, this guy, sometimes your best athletes are not your best open field runners in football or rugby, because like their spacing and timing is just off. They always cut too early and give people time to recover. They always cut too late and they're already in the contact situation. People are scratching their heads like, measurement wise, this is like an elite athlete, speed, agility, change of direction. Well, yeah, but he can't really read the play and his timing is just terrible. So he's only average in the open field. Well, how do we fix that? You got to give him a bunch of open field opportunities and let him learn how to actually win those 1-on-1s or 2-on-1s.
Yeah. I was going to say too, with the like warming up without the ball or doing a lot of work without the ball. I think back to just even working with youth soccer. I mean, half of our practice is without a soccer ball, just because for that age, if you put a soccer ball, it's too much information, there's too much noise, and they don't really truly get to be as much of athletes as they can. So just playing freeze tag with that age is way better from just making sure they get their athleticism in before we get to work with the ball. But I even think to all right, when I was playing high school basketball, what if we would have played like powerball, like we talk about American Gladiators that we were talking about with that, like Jeremy Frisch, that's one of his favorite games. And I've been starting to do that more with my kids. We'll put buckets out in the yard and, they'll try to score on the buckets. And it's amazing. I mean, it's so cool too. Like I watch kids play soccer, like 5, 6, 7-year-olds play. And I think the parents get frustrated. It's like, oh, why isn't my kid more aggressive? Why aren't they running faster or something? It's like, it's because there's too much information. They aren't able to perceive and feel like safe enough and confident enough in their perception to sprint at full speed. But when you just put buckets out and go score on the bucket, now they can. And I think about, a definition of strength, you could say, is just simply when we reduce the degrees of freedom in the movement. Like just a deadlift, there's not a lot of degrees of freedom. You can activate a lot of muscle mass. But even in sport, all right, let's take some of the complex elements out of this. And I think about, well, in basketball, what if we would have warmed up with powerball for 15 minutes, before we got into playing? I wonder what the practice would have been like if we would have done something like that first, instead of, all right, you're going to dribble around and shoot around and do these drills. And, I'm sure there was some things we were working on, but to make things really dynamic, all right, first you're going to do this thing that defies my intellectual explanation on some level. It brings in the biopsychosocial, you could say too, that just competitive, having fun drive. And all right, now let's play or something, like, as long as you're not too tired. It just makes sense.
Well, there's the concept, and I think I stole it from PE, and I think this is what the coaches or the teachers that I follow call it, but the idea of the instant activity. That like when you come in the door, right, like when you have to line up and take roll, like class goes one way. When you have your instant activity, where like when you come in the door, we start like, and it's 2v2 and then it's 3v3 and we just start adding people in, but there's like an instant game. And I go back to that, like that spark, that light up, like there's just something about that can change the complete dynamic of a practice for sure. I know football coaches use like a high contact competitive period often right after warm up early in practice, like as a spark, like, hey, the work day, like we're going to do this little one-on-one battle game, and everyone's in a circle and you've seen it, everyone's cheering and this and that. Oftentimes that's the first thing done at practice. And then you go do all your work. But the culture, the environment, the energy on that day compared to the day that it's like that really slow build up is completely different. Is there a time and place for the slow build up? Like absolutely. And you're trying, maybe your low day, keeping volume down. I don't know. Like there's all sorts of reasons why it could be. But yeah, those spark moments, like absolutely. And I love that instant activity situation. And we're going back to the over structural thing again, like that's a great example where it's like instant activities and pickup games or moderately ruled games that allow for a lot of creativity and kind of exploration as opposed to super structured games are like, it's amazing if you add that at your practice to start your practice, like, you know, what the rest of it looks like instead of having to like, okay, well, it's practice time now. So what's funny to me, when official practice time starts, like all of a sudden people stop moving and start standing in lines because it's practice. And they're like, you know, and so like, you know, that the last 10 minutes before the whistle blew, like you had unadulterated activity, and through the professional's eye, you had amazing tracking and evasion, and you had ball skills and sharing. And, you know, Jeremy talks a lot about the psychological side. Like kids will change teams if the teams are unfair, because yes, people want to win, but they also understand like competition and competitive balance. And so like they switch players around, they do little things, like they make it this really great game. And if you step back from like, is this soccer or is this football, you can start to ID all these physical development concepts. But as soon as practice starts, we get, you know, as Joe Eisman says, the 3 L's, lines, laps, lectures, like we're in it. You know what I mean? And it's like they were just doing that super cool stuff. Like, and you can add some more structure because you have specific goals, but the lines and lectures come because practice started. And I've always been fascinated by that aspect. And I think some of it might be like, oh, well, if the parents see this crazy thing, they're going to think like, I'm not a serious coach, or this isn't real. You know what I mean? Like we're just playing. And some of that is probably the broader communication about, one, the true benefit of it from like a PE physical development strength coach standpoint. But then I'll also hark back to like we are artificially creating some of the experiences that you may have had naturally as a kid, because a lot of these kids are coming in with maybe deficient movement libraries because they're just a little more sheltered.
Yeah, man, the 3 L's. That's great. I was just thinking about like if people were afraid of parents, because I agree. It's just so funny how it's almost like we have this outward perception as a collective of what practice should be, but inside everyone knows that play is where it's at. I feel like if you had the parents and you had a member of the sports staff whose job was actually to take the parents off to the side and do like a Frank Ferenczi style movement, like fun class with them, maybe partially as a distraction, but also to be like, hey, you see how fun and engaging this is? Like, hey, that's what we're doing with these athletes. Isn't this amazing? And you know, maybe I'll finish with this question just because I think it's funny. Well, and before actually I ask it, I love that initial introductory activity too. It makes me think as well about Jeremy Frisch has talked about this probably more than once on my podcast, but how his athletes, if he just lets them go, they're coming in and they'll just start wrestling or playing tag. It's like you're coming into a room full of kids and like, hey, everyone's wrestling and playing tag. Well, I'm going to do that too, you know. And he'll just let him go because that's that introductory activity, and that stimulation is so substantial. And I just think that's really cool. So last question here. So if someone made you like the arbitrator of practice in terms of lines, how long would you say the line, like what's the longest line? Because I've seen lines of 12 kids before, and I'm like, man, this one kid isn't going to get to this skill for like another 3 minutes. I'm just kind of curious if you had an arbitrary number on line length, any thoughts on what that might be?
So it's actually funny. So I coached my son's youth football team. I was an assistant coach because of my travel schedule last year. And it's the first time I'd ever coached under the collegiate level. So all my coaching up to that point had been collegiate professional athletes. And so now I'm going down to third graders. And I think I wrote in the blog that like 3 people was the most I'd ever have in a line, because any more than that, and the back 2 started like pushing and shoving and like, you know, just doing their own little things. And I'm all for roughhouse play, but like when you're trying to, I don't know, keep pace and keep the drill like at least active, like you need the next person to be ready to jump in so that like we can keep the pace high. And so I said, like the coach that I worked with and there was 2 of us. So the first thing we would do every day is we split up into 2 groups, like, which is not rocket science, but I'd see the teams practicing next to us because we had a shared field. and there'd be 3 coaches around one drill with all of the athletes, and all 3 coaches around all 12 athletes right there on that block in the field behind us, all 12 athletes in one drill, all 3 coaches, they're all watching the same thing, they're all doing the same thing. We would split as soon as warm up was done, we would split. And it would be like, all right, you're going to do blocking, I'm going to do tackling, like you're going to do passing and catching, like I'm going to be doing the evasive running, running back stuff. But so like just from the start, we had 2 groups, right? And simple. I will say, I think the reason people do that is there is this belief that coaches need to see every rep. How can I correct and fix it if I'm not watching every rep of every athlete, as opposed to some of that more organic, like it's okay to only provide feedback every 3rd repetition and let them try to figure it out themselves. Like, and, let them learn from their mistakes, or let them, just kind of go through the process. Yes, my coaching cues are a guide, but the idea that like all 3 of us need to see every rep so that we can offer all the cues and all the lectures to fix this kid is like the misnomer of skill learning. So we would split up into 2 groups. And then for me, like I said, if I had my 6, like we would always be in 2 or 3 groups, so that like my lines were only ever 2 or 3. So I'd be set up in a triangle. Like I would never have them in one line of 6. And I tried not to ever have them in 2 lines of 4, like depending on the split up that day. I would much rather go to multiple shorter lines and say like, so, hey, we're going to have 4 lines of 2. And like, I'll pop back and forth between drill box, you know what I mean? Like, or you will be in a triangle rotation, but just because 1, kids hate standing around. 2, they're also 3rd graders. I'm 100% realistic of like their attention span, and they're going to push and shove, and they're going to, talk about a new video game and this and that. So we'll keep short lines. We'll keep really quick. Like the idea that like we're going to coach on the run. You know what I mean? A couple points here, a couple points there. Hey, did you see what Johnny did? Like, that's awesome. You know what I mean? Like a great feat. Everyone try to do that. Like, that's it. The amount of times I saw activities stopped for like the grandioso lecture was just like, astronomical, where it's like, we have to learn by doing at some point. I always say I could rate myself highly as a coach. I could give the best explanation ever. I can do a great demonstration, and how many reps is it going to take that youngster to figure it out in their own body? And it's like, so that's the learning kind of gap, is that even though we've done everything perfect, like they have to accumulate so many repetitions. Our great athletes normally get it in 2. They got 1, they had a little mistake. Oh yeah, my feet were funny. Next time they got it, right? And those are the guys, like, that's why they're an elite athlete, because they can self-correct that movement skill in 2 reps. And then, some guys or gals, it takes forever for them to lock in. But once they lock in, like they're great. So like, I don't panic when I expect the first couple reps to be bad. My coaching cues that I use all the time on early repetitions of a new thing are like, you know what I mean? Like, hey, first time, like you're figuring it out. Here we go. Like, at it again. See if you can find it. Things like that. See if you can find it. Like, you're fine. First rep, no worries. Hey, just like that, just try to do it a little bit better. Like a little, little prod, a little joke, but it's not like over coaching. Like, hey, I just gave you the technical model and I demonstrated the technical model. Now your little knucklehead 3rd grade brain is trying to make your neurons tell your muscles to do that. That's a process. And so like, I'd rather have more repetitions with slight oversight, like, coaching on the run, a cue here, a cue there, and plenty of space for self-exploration and no feedback other than like, you know what I mean? Great effort. You'll get it next time. You know what I mean? Here we go. Just try to clean that up, but not even specific, things where I don't know if you've heard the ABC analogy, which is kind of big in football coaching and maybe creeped into the football weight room, but always be coaching. Always be coaching. Never waste a rep. And I'm just like, but like, if you had a teacher that was like that, you would hate them. You know what I mean? Like, you'd never have time to explore and actually grasp the concept, because you're always getting told like, over and over again, it's just too much info. So yeah, scale it, let it go, fix it. Fix it. If it's a disaster, maybe you do need to step in, but most of the time it's just the natural learning process.
Yeah, I just think so much of that coach as a facilitator. You're helping the athlete in their journey. You're not dictating their journey to them. And I'm sure we could talk about that for a good portion of the show. Sadly, I've run out of time here, Andy, but to get a little bit more to the messy side, maybe we can come back and talk about that messy side of coaching. And you just shared about that a lot, but thank you so much for coming on. It was great talking to you. You got me excited for next soccer season, as well as all my other coaching sessions. So I appreciate you, man.
Always a pleasure, buddy. Happy to come back.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here. If you want to help us out, you can leave us a rating or review on Spotify, iTunes, whatever you're listening to the show on. I'd really appreciate it. We'll see you next week with another great guest.